Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Katie Yates, and it's my pleasure to introduce MDIFW's Regional Fishery Supervisor in the Moosehead Lake region, Tim Obrey. At the end of his presentation, we will be taking some audience questions. So thank you everyone again for joining us today on a Saturday, and thank you, Tim. I'm just gonna pass it over to him now and let him do his presentation and say whatever he needs to.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here and we'll get on with the presentation. All right, how's that look? Pretty good? So today I'm going to talk about what's going on with Moosehead with the shore spawning brook trout. First, before I get started, I want to thank Katie for putting this presentation on. Katie and the crew down there at our I&E division have just done an outstanding job with our public outreach, with all these social media things that the folks in the region just have no clue about. And it's a great opportunity for us to share some of the information. We're working on some really cool projects, and it's a great opportunity for us to share it, and I'm grateful to have it. So today I want to talk a little bit about Moosehead and what's going on with the brook trout. And for those of you that fish Moosehead, you know that we're sort of in what I would call the pinnacle of trout fishing right now. It's been pretty exciting. We've had the last 3 years just an incredible number of trophy trout caught in the lake, and it's entirely related to a fairly recent discovery of some shore spawning brook trout in the lake, which is, it's kind of unique because brook trout, we think of brook trout as spawning up in our tributaries, like the Moose River, the Roach River, Saskatchewan Stream, and these trout are actually spawning on the shore, and they're quite different in their behavior. And so I just kind of want to start with a little story here. I don't know, I wrote a little bit about it in one of my fishing reports a year or so ago, but when I first came on with IFNW, I worked as a student back in the mid 80s, and Roger O'Clair was still around, and Paul Johnson and Scott Roy were his assistants. And there was a story Roger passed down to us about a fella he knew from Rockwood who had told him one year that he had seen some trout spawning under the ice on Moosehead. Now this fella was an outdoorsman. He knew what he was talking about. And he was a caretaker for cabins, and he did some trapping. So he was out and about on the lake in the fall. So it was an unusual story because the trout usually spawn in October. And of course, there's not really any ice on Moosehead in October in a typical year. And when there is ice, usually after Thanksgiving, the trout are normally done spawning. So this was just kind of it was a little mystery for everybody. It was something that was always in the back of my head. It's always been in the back of my head. And it's funny because we've looked for him. Paul and Scott had looked for him in the past with some netting, and we've never had been successful. And then in 2017, I got a call from somebody. I don't remember if it was a call or an email, but they said, you know, we see some big fish along the shoreline, and we think they're trout. So we sent of course, it blew me away, just the thought of it, because this said the story I had remembered from back in the 1980s. And so we went right up and checked it out, and it was just one of the most spectacular things I've ever seen as a fisheries biologist and as a fisherman. We got to the spot, and there were probably a dozen, maybe 20 of these trout that were, the smallest one was probably around 3 pounds. And there were some there that were pushing the 8-pound mark, and they're all within just a few feet of us, and cruising around the shore, doing their thing. So it was pretty remarkable. And we wanted to get a little bit more information about these fish and where they were going, what they were doing. And so we've been studying them ever since 2017, really. And it was a little bit funny because I went back through some of the records to look at some of the netting that Paul and Scott had done in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of the netting they had done was in the right place, but just at the wrong time. So it was kind of interesting. So we've been following these fish. caught up here. So we've been following these fish for, like I said, since 2017. We did a little bit of work on this initial site, but really 2018, 19, and 20, we went right at it, and we're collecting some information. So here are some pictures from some of the smiling faces. It's really exciting, an exciting time on Moosehead. It's an exciting time to be a fisheries biologist on Moosehead. I don't think there's ever been a time, you know, at least since World War II, where we've seen something like this. There's some earlier records, some camp records that go back to the 1800s, where you see some big fish in the records, but it's really remarkable right now what we have. And there's certainly a lot of interest from the public and from the department in protecting and trying to get the most we can out of this fishery, protect it, and hopefully make it last. So where did all these fish come from all of a sudden?
Tim, you might want to, right now I think everybody can see the entire screen for the PowerPoint. Is there a way that you can share it so it's full screen?
Oh.
There you go. Yeah, perfect. Sorry about that.
Technically challenged. Thanks, Katie. Okay, so where did these trout come from? Well, there's always been a component of the Moosehead Lake fishery there's been these trophy fish. And I'm gonna see if I can put a pointer up here. So you can see, this chart here shows you the percentage of brook trout over 18 inches in our winter harvest. So we're out there, if you're out there on Moosehead fishing, you've probably run into some of our biologists. We're out there collecting data almost every winter. We have since the late 1960s. And you can see right here, for a long time, there's always been a few big trout in the lake, over 20 inches. But if you look at what's happened here, the last few years, especially, the component of trophy fish has gone way, way up to 35% in 2019 and 2020. And it really got started back around 2007. We had a little bit of a saddle here in 2010, but you can see it went up, had a little bit of a drop, and then it's gone way up again. So there's always been a few big trout, but right now we're at the peak. So some of the factors that have gone into producing this trophy brook trout fishery are actually more related to other species than brook trout. And I think one of the biggest factors is the extensive removal of lake trout that we started in 2008. Moosehead was in a tough situation for about 20 years where we just had too many lake trout and we had to thin them down. The growth was suffering for lake trout and salmon. So in 2008, we implemented a no size of bag limit on lake trout under 18 inches. And we also liberalized the bag limit to 2 fish on lake trout over 18 inches. And in that period of 2008 to 2010, we took out 100,000 lake trout with the angler harvest from Moosehead. That's a lot of mouths. And the smelt population just took off after we thinned down the lake trout. So we were documenting some of our best growth ever in lake trout, in our salmon, and we were seeing improvements in our survival and our hatchery salmon. And you don't really think of brook trout relying on smelt so much for food like the lake trout and the salmon do, but there were improvements in our growth in brook trout. And once brook trout get over a certain size, they do feed on smelts in Moosehead Lake. So they were benefiting from the rebound in the smelt population as well. And another factor that probably plays a big role in the improvement in the trophy fish population is the increase in the minimum length on brook trout from 12 to 14 inches in 2006, which we feel protected about 30% of the fish that would be normally harvested. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs that kind of document this. So this is a lake trout graph, but I love to show this one because it really sends the message home about what went on with the lake trout. And so these are winter catch rates for lake trout on Moosehead. And generally your catch rates are reflective of your population. So the higher your catch rates, the more fish you have. The lower your catch rates, the fewer fish you have. So you can see back here in the late 70s through 1986, it was about 50-50 for lake trout. So the green line is the catch rate for lake trout under 18 inches. The blue line is the catch rate for lake trout over 18 inches. So the green line is what we normally would call a sublegal lake trout. And like I said, it was about 50-50, half and half, fish over 18, under 18 in the catch in the wintertime. That's a fairly balanced population. And then you can see right here in the late 80s, early 90s, the population, the number of lake trout under 18 just went right through the roof. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. I could do a whole nother presentation on what that was all about. But the fact is, we saw a huge increase in the lake trout population. They weren't growing, and it stayed high, like I said, for darn near 20 years until we saw it going back up again in around 2005, 2006. The catch rates were going back up, and finally we said finally we're going to get ahead of this, and we're just going to stop nibbling on the regulations. We're going all in, and we went no size of bag limit in 2008. And you can see what happened immediately after that. As I said earlier, we took out 100,000 fish, and the catch rates for short fish just dropped. And right now, since 2013, it's been right back about 50-50, which is right where we wanted it. And I'm not going to say we went into that knowing exactly how many fish had to come out. When we went into that regulation change, we knew we were just going to have to monitor it. And when catch rates started to drop, we knew we were impacting the population and would have to change the regs. So it worked out excellent. And so now we feel like our lake trout population is balanced to where it should be. So a couple of things I want to point out here. We had this big surge in short fish, and we always hear, well, you got to have small fish to get big fish. That's true to a point. But you look at the catch rates down here for lake trout that are over 18, we never really saw a huge increase in the catch rates for lake trout over 18, even though we had all these numbers of short fish. So what was happening is there was great reproduction, but there wasn't enough food to grow them into the legal size. So yes, you need short fish to get big fish, but if you have too many short fish and your growth is bad, you're not going to get any bigger fish. And the other thing I want to point out is how effective that regulation change was. We were able to harvest our way out of this problem by removing those lake trout. And it's not to say the problems won't come back again, or the problems don't change. It's not, I joke around, say, you know, fisheries management's not like a Ron Popeil oven where you can set it and forget it. You have to monitor these things every year because there are changes. Mother Nature throws changes at you. There's changes in angler activity. So you do have to monitor. But right now, after removing all those togue, and we want to thank the anglers who came up to Moosehead, participated in the derbies in the wintertime. They got the message, they took those togue home, and we are right where we want to be. So that's a good thing. The other, just want to show this other chart. When I mentioned earlier, we went from 12 to 14 inches on the minimum length for brook trout back in 2006. So we were able to look at the brook trout size frequency prior to that regulation to look and see what percentage of those fish would be saved. So by going from 12 to 14 inches, we knew these fish were all going to be protected from harvest, which is about 30% of what was going down the road in the wintertime. So just as a general rule of thumb in fisheries, if you can save 25 to 30% of the fish that are currently being harvested, you're going to see a change in your population. It's going to be something you can measure because there are a lot of natural fluctuations in population. So if you're just nibbling with regulations around the edges, you know, and you're protecting 10 or 15%, Mother Nature might mask that change, whatever change comes from that regulation change. But if you can protect 25 or 30%, you're probably going to see a positive result. And I think that had a big part of where we are right now. So these trophy trout, they appear to be mostly, if not all, shore spawning brook trout, really. And we've done a ton of work on Moosehead in our tributaries. And if any of you fish the roach, you've seen our weir. that we put on the lower end of the river. We've done that 3 or 4 times. We've done a bunch of radio telemetry, pit tagging. We've had the weir on Saukadian Stream. Roger O'Clair had a weir over there in the late 1950s that he built. And so we went back about 50 years after Roger's project and put our weir in there, and we had remarkably similar results. And we did a bunch of, Roger did some jaw tagging and survival estimates, and we'd used, of course, technology has advanced quite a bit. We use pit tags and radio telemetry gear to look at survival. And so most of the brook trout and moosehead are spawning in places like the Moose, the Roach, Saukadian, and the smaller tributaries. And we know those fish move into the streams sometimes as early as late August if you get a good flush of water. But from our telemetry and tagging work, we know that those trout are in those tributaries from at least from September. They spawn the first 2 weeks of October. They're almost all done spawning by the 3rd week of October. And by the 1st week of November, the trout that have spawned up in the tributaries have dropped back into the lake. They usually set up in an area and they stay there all winter. They don't move around a lot in the wintertime. So that's what we knew going into this project about the stream spawning trout. But these shore spawning trout are different, okay? They don't even come in to these areas until after Veterans Day in November. It's pretty remarkable. We do see shore spawning in our trout ponds. I can think of a couple ponds just outside of Greenville where you can go the last week of September, 1st week of October, and see trout sitting on their redds, their nests, just like bass. And so it's not uncommon to see trout spawning on the shore in those places, but it's very uncommon in these bigger lakes. And they are attracted to groundwater. So it's not like they just spawn anywhere along the shore. It's probably entirely related to places where there are springs coming into the lake. So as I said, they spawn in mid-November. And if you know anything about moosehead, you know that by Thanksgiving, the ice is starting to form on moosehead. So a lot of the spawning activity actually goes on under the ice, just like this fella had told Roger he had seen. So we see compelling evidence that some of these fish may still be spawning in January after the beginning of the ice fishing season, which is just incredible. So as I said, we've done radio telemetry. We know where these fish are. Even though we can't see them under the ice, we know where they are, and they're still hanging around those spawning areas after Christmas. They're extremely vulnerable to fishing. If you've ever seen trout spawning or been around fish that have been spawning, even other species like bass, they're hyper aggressive during the spawning season, right? So if these fish are spawning under the ice during fishing season and you drop a minnow down there, somebody's going to hit it. They're not going to just accept the fact that another fish is moving in on their territory during the spawning season. So the anglers can really do a job on them if they're spawning, which is why we don't allow spawning in our tributaries in October, because the fish are so vulnerable. So anglers have discovered a large concentration of these fish in Lily Bay over the last couple of years. And that's not the spot that we were researching, but we knew from our work in the wintertime on the ice and from photos we're seeing, people sending to us information from the Warden Service that there's something going on in Lily Bay. And they're all trophy trout. Of course, they're harvested at a high rate. A lot of people would like to keep a fish like that. It's a fish of a lifetime, put it on the wall. Certainly understand that. But even if they're done spawning and they're just congregated, like we see with our stream spawning fish in October, November, after they've dropped out, they're still focusing the harvest on those fish, and it is a disruption with the angling activity with the spawning activity that's going on. So we really had to do something in short order last year to protect what was going on, protect these big fish in the lake. So just a couple of pictures. This is a photo we took on Moosehead. I think this was opening week of the ice fishing season. And you can see this is a male trout, and then there's milt running down the anal fin out of the vent right there in January. Now, if you've ever caught a trout in the wintertime, it's not uncommon to see some eggs in a female trout, especially with some of our hatchery fish. They just don't drop all of the eggs. Some of them remain in the body cavity. But it's kind of uncommon to see it with the males. You just don't see it. They're usually done when when the spawning season is over, and it's just a little bit unusual. And then this is a fish. This is a photo somebody sent me after I put out my fishing report, and you can see the shape of the ovaries on this fish are still swollen. The eggs are fresh. This fish was caught at the end of January. And after it was harvested, you can see the eggs were coming out after the body relaxed. So this is the end of January of clearly a mature gravid female brook trout. And then this other photo over here is from a stomach from a brook trout on Moosehead. So if you've been out fishing on Moosehead in the wintertime and you've been checked by a biologist, you'll know that we routinely take stomach samples from all of our fish. And that's the way we monitor our smelt population. We count the smelts, we measure the smelts, measure the volume of food. And so this is a trout stomach that was caught. This was the last week of January. And these are trout eggs in the stomach. So it's not necessarily from a female that didn't drop all her eggs. This fish had actually consumed brook trout eggs in January. So think about that for a minute, because brook trout bury their eggs down at least 6 inches to 12 inches. So at some point in mid to late January, this fish had access to free floating brook trout eggs, which tells me there was probably some spawning going on. So as I mentioned, we felt the pressure to do something last year. This chart is a representation of angler use in Lily Bay on Moosehead. So we fly the lake every winter, almost every winter, and count anglers, and we have the lake divided up into different areas so we can keep track of fishing pressure. And Lily Bay falls in area right on the borderline with areas 2 and 3. So this chart shows that really from 1990 through 2017, it's pretty consistent. The areas 2 and 3, the Lily Bay area, is about 25% of the total use on Moosehead. And that represents about 3,000 angler days in a typical winter, which is 12,000 angler days total. But now, after people found those brook trout in Lily Bay, 45% of our use, 45 to 50% of the total use on Moosehead was focused on Lily Bay. And not only that, but the total number of angler days went up on Moosehead. It almost doubled. So we typically have 12,000 angler days in the winter on Moosehead. Now we're looking at 23,000 angler days. 45% of that is about 10,000 man days of fishing in Lily Bay compared to 3,000. And most of it was focused in a small area focused on trout. So those fish were at high risk. I think that's a pretty good explanation of what really was the impetus for us to do something last year. So what was our goal? Our first goal was to protect that concentration of shore spawning fish in Lily Bay. Even though we hadn't worked on that spot, we knew from, like I said, we knew from our contacts that there were fish there somewhere. So we needed to do something to protect that. And then we also looked at whether we wanted to go on to further measures and do something lake-wide. So I'm not going to go through all of these options, but I just want to let you know that we did a really thorough analysis of all the possible regulation options that we thought we had, including reinstating the 300-foot law, which was something unique to Moosehead that was on there for quite a while, which basically said you couldn't fish within 300 feet of the shoreline except for islands. But it was kind of ambiguous. It's kind of ambiguous. It was a little bit difficult to enforce. We didn't want to go that way. We did look at all the other pros and cons. And in the end, we had decided to go with a slot limit and an area closure. Now, I've got a stakeholders group that I meet with twice a year on Moosehead. It's the Moosehead Lake Fisheries, Moosehead Lake Focus Group. And we talk about everything fisheries on Moosehead. And we got together with that group and talked about all these options. And there was a lot of support from that group as well as from the public. Just a tremendously positive experience with these regulation changes. Everybody wanted to protect these trout. There was nobody that was opposed in any way. There were some people, I'm sure there are people that are bummed because they like to fish right out in front of the state park and they can't anymore. but it was overwhelmingly supported to do something to protect these trout. So this map shows the closed area in blue, basically from Laker Point to Porcupine Point, and then on the north side, and then on the southwest side from the Lily Bay State Park boundary over to Sugar Island, just west of Dollar Island. So that area, we closed it off. And we also put on the slot limit, 18 to 22 inch trout must be released. And that is to be applied summer and winter. And it includes the east outlet in the Moose River. So we didn't want to, one of the goals going into this, we didn't want to be divisive and pit ice fishermen versus summer fishermen. We've seen that before, even though at Moosehead, a lot of the fishermen fish both seasons, but we didn't want to get into a fight. We didn't want to have ice fishermen bear all the responsibility, because there are a lot of fish that are caught in the summer as well, and they're harvested at a similar rate. So we wanted to spread the responsibility. And so we went both summer and winter with the slot limit. And this summer will be the first one coming up where it's in effect. So we'll see how it goes. I think it's going to work out great. I know the closed area worked really well this winter. We didn't see quite as many photos on Facebook, or people didn't send them to us. That's probably a good thing, but those fish are still there for sure. I'm going to show you some photos from this fall that are going to make you start to drool for open water. So, as I said, we've been evaluating these fish, the shore spawners, really since 2017. This is the big fish here on the left is about a 7-pound fish, just under 7-pound fish that we handled, a male, just a beautiful, beautiful specimen. And Maddie Killian there is holding about a 6-pound male that we put a radio tag in. And one of the things I want to point out, you know, you got a trophy fish, you know, you got an old one when you see this on the dorsal fin. These big fish, you look at any of the videos that I put up or any of the photos, and you'll see this, I call it the old, it's like an old gray beard on these big fish. When they get old and big like that, the tip of their dorsal gets white. You can see it a little bit on this one here on the Maddie's holding as well. But as I flip through these photos, and if you go back and look at this presentation and look at any of these big fish, you'll see that on those. And we see it in other places too. We've seen it in the Rapid River, some of the work they've done over there. We've seen some videos and they have it over there as well. So I can't run the video now while I'm doing this presentation, but if you go on YouTube and you just type in my name or Legends of Lily Bay, or maybe Katie can post the link here in the chat. But I taken some really interesting video. We had a GoPro the first year that I tucked in into one of the spawning areas, and then last year we were fortunate enough to purchase an underwater drone, which we were going to use specifically for this purpose because we wanted to be able to go under the ice and check out some of these places. So I got some really cool video. I mean, it's just outstanding stuff to see these big monster trout, and they like the camera. So one of our objectives this year was to spend time in Lily Bay. Now, as I said, they spawn after Veterans Day. And so in 2018 through 2020, we were fortunate enough to get a week and a half of work in before the lake froze over. It's a dangerous time to be on the lake, really, in November in a boat. This year, Mother Nature gave us a big break, because we had a couple of days where it was in the mid 50s and flat calm in Lily Bay. It was just unbelievable. So our goal was to go out and try to find some of these spawning areas. And Jeff, who's wearing the orange coat here, he checks Lily Bay in the winter. So he knew some areas that we could start with. And the idea was we're going to set a trap net. We're going to capture some of these fish. We're going to put radio tags in them, and we're going to follow them home and find out where they're spawning to see if the protective area was the right thing to do, and if we got it all in the right spot. So it's funny, we went out the first day, and like I said, we were just going to randomly start setting nets, and we went to one place where Jeff had seen some fish caught, and we didn't have to set a net. There was an area there that was probably, I don't know, 20, 25 yards long and probably another 15 or 20 yards wide, just this big circular area on a flat calm day that you could see was clean, cleared gravel. And sure enough, right on the edges of it, there were probably 24 of these monster trout swimming around. So it's just an unbelievable thing to see. The Moosehead is mostly muddy when you get offshore, and you just come up on this one spot. It's just this beautiful, clean gravel, and there they are in their glory doing their thing. So we were pretty excited. It was within the closed area, and so we continued around for the rest of the day, and we never saw another area that day. And we ran out of time, so we were coming back on the second day, and the plan was to set a net and radio tag some of those fish. And while the net set, we were going to pick up where we left off and cruise around Lily Bay and see if we could find any other spots. Well, we hadn't gone 10 minutes from where we left off the day before, and we found another spot. And that was a smaller area, but as we tooled along the shoreline in that area, we ended up finding another half a dozen of these smaller trout reds, all with fish on them, all cleared off. And so that was great to see. This was a place that was probably a mile away from the first spot that we had found the day before. And then we ended up noting a third spot that was very tiny. It was just like a foot or two across, but it looked suspicious. It could have been a place where a moose had stepped and, the sediment had just blown away. But it looked suspicious. And we ended up coming back to that spot a couple of weeks later. And sure enough, the trout had opened it right up. And I think there were 3 or 4 reds in that general area. So this was a week or two after we had seen the first spot. So it was clear that the fish were still coming in. This was now the 3rd week of November, just before Thanksgiving. And the trout was still coming in, still building new sites. And so we had set a net that second day, and I think we took 8 trout overall over the course of a couple of days of netting, and we radio tagged them. And this is Steve holding one of those bruisers. I think that fish was probably just over 6 pounds. You can see the little white tip on the dorsal. So this is the second spot we found. Doesn't look like much right there, though. We had actually bumped the fish off the spot a little bit right there, and they were up tight to the shoreline on some rocks. But those fish are all 3 to 5 pounds right there. This is the actual red. You can see the cleared gravel right here and right in here, and you can see this is what Moosehead typically looks like around the edges. It's all muddy and silty, and this red, that thing is down 12, 14 inches. That's how far down they dug. And then this is the first spot right here. So you can see it's just all beautiful gravel. And if you look at that video, it's fun to watch because this fish right here, I snuck in real slow and just parked it. And you can see when they noticed the drone, they came right over and started checking it out, looking at it, seeing if it was a threat to them or whatever. And then they just kind of went and did their own thing. But it's pretty, if you like trout, and I'm sure everybody here does, it's pretty cool to see that. So I just want to focus in on some of the stuff that we've learned now from our radio telemetry and our pit tags and the work we've done over the last couple of years. So this little table here shows some post-spawning mortality rates. And I just want to show you. So here's Roger O'Clair's study back in '57. He used jaw tags on Saugcattian Stream, and he estimated that 64% of the males succumbed after the spawning season, which is high. That's a fairly significant number. And it's just because of all the rigors of spawning. Those fish are tucked into those streams for a month or two. The birds are after them. The mink are after them. The otters are after them. They're chasing each other. It's a strenuous period for them, and not everybody makes it out. So Roger had 64% in '57. We went back in 2010. We had 60% with our radio tags and 57%. That's pretty consistent for a fishery study to see that consistency in mortality rates. And we did some work on the roach. We also did some work up to Chamberlain with some radio tags. But generally 50 to 60% of your males are going to succumb right after spawning. Those are your stream spawners. But what we found with our radio telemetry work on the shore spawning, it was only 20 to 30%, so half. And that's because they're spawning under the ice. So right away, your avian predators are knocked out of the equation. They're not going to be taking any. It's a heck of a lot easier for a trout to escape an otter when he can run off into 50 feet of water and 75,000 acres as opposed to being trapped in the Roach River or Circadian Stream. So they just have better survival all around. So what does that that equals? Older fish. You can get older fish if they're surviving at that rate. And what we found on the Roach and Circadian, those trout are generally 3 and 4 year old trout with a few 5-year-olds. And what we found with our shore spawning fish is these are generally 5 to 8 year old trout. That's why they're getting so big. They've got good growth or had good growth, and they're surviving longer. Another thing we've learned with our shore spawning is they are similar to our stream spawning fish, and that they do a lot, they're homers, right? So in 2019, we had 6 mature shore spawning trout with active tags in the lake, and they all returned to the exact same spawning location in 2019, 2020. So they came right back. And we found the same thing with our radio telemetry work on the Roach and Circadian. And here's a little chart I use in my Chamberlain presentation just to show you. It's just a really interesting life history thing, but these little red dots indicate the location of a fish that we had radio tagged in Chamberlain. And we captured this fish for the first time on October 13th of 2006 on the west shore of the lake. We put a radio tag in him, and 3 days later, he was up in Allagash Stream spawning, which no surprise there. And so over the course of the next year, he hung out right in the middle of the lake. He was in Mudbrook Cove, down around Nugent's, up around the farm. And in September, late September of 07, he was down around Nugent's. Well, a couple of weeks later, a year exactly to the date of the 2006 work, he was right back in Allagash Stream spawning. So brook trout, whether they're stream spawners or shore spawners, they home back to the same spot each year that they're sexually mature. So as I mentioned, this is kind of one of the things I want to impress on everybody is these fish come in late. So this is one of the shore spawning areas. And this is, I believe this is after Thanksgiving, and the lake is freezing. And as I mentioned, the spawning activity goes on around springs. And so here you can see what the springs look like. There's a little bit of open water next to shore. We actually went in and snorkeled on this site in August, and it was pretty remarkable. You could feel the cold water in the gravel all along the shoreline. There are reds all along the shoreline and further down from where you can see here. And there was one little spot where there was a piece of ledge. And we came up on the ledge, and we could see some fontinalis, which is a green aquatic plant that grows in cold water. It's got the same first name as brook trout because they occur together frequently. Brook trout and fontinalis, they like cold water. So here's this fontinalis growing out of this ledge, and I stick my hand down in the crack in the ledge, and it's like somebody's got a garden hose on with ice cold water just pouring out of this thing. So it must be coming out all along the shore, and that's why the trout are attracted to this spot. That's why it freezes late. But these fish are radio tagged and standing right here on the shore. Even though we can't see them, we're pinging them. We know they're there, and it's getting close to Christmas, So they're there. It's happening under the ice. As I mentioned, they're older fish. So this is a photograph of an otolith, which is a tiny little bone in the head of fish, and we can use it to age fish. Typically, we use scales when we can, but when you get into older fish, it's a little tougher with the scales to read. So we've been fortunate. Roger Adams, who's a taxidermist in Herman, he fishes Moosehead. He's one of our regulars up there, and he's had a lot of customers, of course, come through his taxidermist shop with trophy trout. And he called us and said, "Hey, I can save some trout heads for you if you guys want to get the otoliths." And it's a great opportunity. We appreciate Roger's efforts and cooperation. So he saved the heads off of these fish that he was mounting, and we were able to pull the otoliths out and age them. And so this is a good shot of a 6-year-old brook trout that was a shore spawner. I think that was probably a 5-pound fish. So just a couple more slides, and then we'll take some questions. And I want to show the difference in the length frequency to show you the difference in the size of these fish. So the red and green bars here represent the inch class, the length frequency of fish in Saccadian and roach. And you can see they average right around 13 to 14 inches. And a big fish is typically 17. We get a handful of 18-inch fish in the Roach River, but most of your fish in the tributaries are 12 to 15 inches long. Well, we hardly see any fish that small on the shore spawning fish that we've netted. They're all, 18 to 24 inches. These are big old fish, clearly different. So with that, I'm sure Katie's been taking down some questions, some comments, and I'll try to help you out and answer some.
Yeah, that sounds great. So a couple of questions that we had coming in, are related to your presentation. And I had a question actually that I thought of that I'm just going to pitch to you real quick before we get to the couple of questions that came in. The question that I have, and I think everyone's probably very familiar with radio collars that you put on moose or bear. Can you explain a little bit of how the radio telemetry works when you're working with fish?
Sure. So it involves surgery. And actually this picture right here, you can see this fish is in a bucket with some water, and we put some anesthesia in there. So we surgically implant a transmitter into these fish, and the antenna sticks out of the body. And so there are two methods really that we use to track the fish. The most common method is with a receiver and an antenna, and we either strap it to the plane, or actually the planes that the Warden Service have now, they actually have antennas permanently mounted on them, so we can just plug in our receivers and we fly over the lake. And when we get close to the fish, we can pick up the signal. We have the different frequencies plugged into these receivers, so we just scroll through the frequencies, and we start hearing it. We'll hear it ping. We'll zero in on it. We'll fly over it, and we'll be able to locate them. The other technology we use is that there's a stationary unit that they make. So, for example, if anybody had fished on the Roach River, you may have seen our solar panels tucked into a few places, and there'd be some big, we had some pelican cases next to it. And what would happen is we'd leave those, for example, at the mouth of the Roach, and they'd run constantly 24/7. And when the fish come in, the data logger would pick it up, so we'd know the time and the date and the frequency of the fish that moved up the stream. And we've done that. We've put them in different locations on the Roach, so you know how far they've moved up. We've done it on different areas around Chamberlain. When we did the Chamberlain work, we had one at the thoroughfare, so we knew when they were passing between Chamberlain and Round Pond. We had one down at Telos Dam, so we knew if anybody dropped out. So those are typically the ways that we track the fish. We can do it on foot or by boat as well. And the other thing, those tags also have what we call a mortality switch. If the fish dies or it doesn't move for 24 hours, the pinging basically increases in speed, so we can tell when the fish is dead, which is handy to know.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to get to some audience questions now. One that just came in: do river spawners ever become shore spawners?
We don't think so. So that's a great question, and it was one that we had initially. So when we started to see that bump in the catch rate of big brook trout going up, we went back to the Roach with our weir, and we said, let's go see if we can catch some of these big fish. And we didn't get any of those big fish. Now, we ended the weir we ended that project in the middle of October. So we weren't there in November. We don't know if there are any fish that go up that river in November to spawn like these fish. But we know from our radio telemetry work that there doesn't seem to be any overlap in either way, either the radio tag fish from the Roach showing up on the shore, or from the shore spawning fish going up in the Roach.
Great, thanks. So another one that came in, and I know that you can really only speak to your region, but they had a question about any goals in particular for anglers to harvest a certain type of species or length.
Yeah, so well, for example, on Moosehead, we still are encouraging people to remove lake trout within the confines of the current regulations, which includes 5 fish under 18 inches. We're still trying to keep ahead of that. And in our other lakes in the region, places like Chesuncook, where we have too many salmon, we're encouraging people to take those fish as well. So if you see any of those regulations in the law book where there's no size or bag on a game species like salmon or lake trout in particular, we are really trying to thin that population down, just like we did on Moosehead in 2008. It's our management goal. It's different. I know when I first started work, and through the, in the early 80s through the early 90s, we had a lot more fishing pressure back then. And our concern was protecting the fisheries from being over harvested. And now fishing pressure has really settled down, and there's room for harvest in a lot of places. And in a lot of places, it's beneficial, just like we've seen on Moosehead. If you can remove some of those predators, you make the forage population more abundant, and all the species benefit from that. So that's why we have those regulations.
Great, thank you. And so another question that came in, and there have been a few kind of on this theme, is we're getting ready for summertime. People are thinking about planning their fishing trips to Moosehead and thinking about how they want to fish for brook trout. What are some bits of advice that you can give people?
Sure, that's a great question. So the best brook trout fishing occurs close to ice out, whether it's Moosehead or even in our trout ponds. Just as the ice is going out, these trout are still close to the shoreline, and so they're a little easier to catch. The big fish are super aggressive. So if you want to come to Moosehead and catch a big trout, your best bet is to be here within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on the temperatures of ice out. Fish close to shore, use your streamers or your lures, and get right in amongst the rocks. And just troll. I don't know about casting. There's some places you could probably go and cast if you knew where you were going, and there were some smelts concentrated maybe. But your best bet is to just troll the shoreline with either streamers or some lures.
And I'll just do a quick safety pitch. I know that people are anxious to get out there, and just to be cautious and always wear some type of life vest or personal flotation device to make sure that you're safe when you're out there. The water is cold for a long time, and you don't want to be caught out there.
Right.
So the next question that I have for you is there, let's see. I guess the next question is, a few people have been asking about the relationship between bass and lake trout and brook trout, and if you've seen any correlation between those species and brook trout health. Is that something that you can answer?
Sure. So we did have an illegal introduction of bass into Moosehead back in the mid-1970s. And bass typically occupy the shoreline habitat where trout prefer to be. So there is definitely competition for habitat between bass and brook trout. Bass, I can't think, I've been doing this for a long time. I cannot think of too many lakes in the state of Maine where we have a good wild brook trout population in conjunction with a bass population. They just don't coexist together. Now, Moosehead's a little different. It's been a little different for a couple reasons. First of all, bass are a warm water species, and Moosehead is a very cold lake. So we've actually done some modeling with our bass, and one of the little quirks about bass is the fact that if they don't reach a certain size their first year at large, they don't survive the winter, because basically they stop feeding once the water temperature drops below 50 degrees. So the growing season on Moosehead is very, very short for bass, and we see high mortality. In some years, we get almost 100% mortality on bass fry. That's a great thing for the trout. Now, there are some areas in Moosehead where the water stays a little warmer, places like Lily Bay, Spencer Bay. Bass have gotten into those areas, and they have established populations there. but in a lot of ways, they were thermally isolated from other areas of the lake. It was very rare that you would hear of a bass caught in downtown Greenville. You just didn't hear of it. You could go to Lily Bay and catch them under the docks at the state park, or you could go to Spencer Bay and catch them along the shoreline. But Rockwood, Greenville, not so much. Now, we've had an unfortunate circumstance in the last few years. I think it was 2012. I think it was 2012. We documented smallmouth bass in Big Wood Pond, which is devastating because Big Wood Pond is above Moosehead in the Moose River drainage. It's connected to Addian Lake and Long Pond and Braswell Lake, and those are all shallower lakes, and they're much more suitable for bass reproduction than Moosehead. And now what we're seeing is all those bass that live in those upper waters are dropping into Rockwood down through the dam at Moose River. So where Rockwood was kind of protected, thermally isolated from the bass in Lily Bay and Spencer Bay, now we have these big lakes that are just bass factories dropping fish into that area. So I anticipate over the next 15 years, we're going to see an increase in the bass population, which it's not a good thing for the trout. I think part of the question was how do bass impact lake trout? I don't think bass have much impact on lake trout at all. They have totally different life requirements. So I don't think there's much of an impact on lake trout, but certainly on brook trout, bass are no good.
Oh yeah, and part of that question too was whether or not the lake trout have affected the brook trout population as well.
So the lake trout and brook trout evolved together. They're native in most of our lakes. The problem is if you get too many of any species, it affects the forage for whatever else is there feeding on it. So even though they are native and they've been in Moosehead forever, the fact that we had too many lake trout definitely impacted the growth and survival for brook trout. So that's why we had to get things under control, get things a little bit more in balance, if there is such a thing as balance in fisheries. I laugh about that because I don't know if there's any such thing as balance, or I hear people talk about, fish go in cycles. Well, it's not so much cycles, it's just erratic. It's up and down in any given year. And Mother Nature, especially with smelt populations, Mother Nature can just wreak havoc on you. And I'll give you a good example. With Moosehead, even though we had some of our best growth coming out of that harvest period from 2008 to 2010, the smelt population absolutely tanked in 2012. Even though the lake trout population was well in check, we had a bad year. That was the year that we had an ice out the second week of April. And the smelts all came in and spawned the third week of April thinking, it's over, here's spring. So they went and spawned. And then by the end of April, we went back to winter for a couple of weeks. So I think we had a real high mortality on smelt fry and smelt eggs. And as I said, the smelt population just crashed on its own. It had nothing to do with the predators. And so we went from having some of the best growth to some of the worst growth in a matter of 2 years. And it rebounded, it went back up. But now again, we're in a saddle right now. We're in a downward trend for smelt. So yeah, you got to try to keep things as balanced as much. We're just biologists. All we can do is control the harvest, and we can't control the weather, Mother Nature. So we do what we can do and try to keep things prepared. So when Mother Nature gives us good conditions, things will take off. And I think that's where we are with Moosehead right now. We're in a good position. We're just waiting for the smelt population to do its thing.
Great, thank you. And so we have time for a couple more questions here. One that I just saw came in is, if you catch a radio tagged fish, what should you do with it? Throw it back, report it? What are the options?
We would like people to release their radio tagged fish because we have just a handful of them. It's not so much the expense. I mean, those tags probably cost $150 a piece. And we've had a bunch of tags. People have donated them, but the data we gather from those fish is very valuable. And one of the things we don't want to do is study these fish to death, right? We don't want to go out there and tag a bunch of fish every year and stress them out. So we do as little as we can to get as much data as we can. So we'd really appreciate if people would release those fish especially the smaller ones. Those tags can go for 2 years, sometimes 3 years if we're lucky. So we can really learn a lot from the smaller fish that we tag. So we'd appreciate it if people put those back. If you want to give us a call and tell us where you caught it and that you caught a radio tag fish, we could probably tell you exactly where that fish was tagged and where he's been. We could give you a little bit of history information, because if you tell us, for example, you caught a tagged fish at the north end of Sugar Island and we've flown that over that area within the last month, we'll know exactly which fish you caught and what the history behind that fish was. So it could be interesting.
Great, thanks. And so maybe on that theme, thinking about how can the public help Maine's fisheries? What are some things the public can do?
Well, the best thing folks can do for us is to keep voluntary record books for us. That is by far the most important thing you can do, because there are, not just on Moosehead, but we have 250,000 acres of water in my region, which goes from Dover Foxcroft up to Allagash Lake and from Rainbow Lake over to Holub. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of ponds, ponds that somehow I'll never get to in my career. And we rely on information from anglers to give us a heads up if something goes wrong. And you folks are the ones that are out there fishing these places. Some people fish the same ponds year after year. And that kind of information is just incredibly valuable to us to track populations. I can give you a good example. We had the folks at the Yoke Pond camps have kept records for us for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, one of the ponds that was one of their top producers just shut right off. And sure enough, there was a summer kill there, or a winter kill. And we went in and it was brought to our attention by the people that kept the records for us. And we looked at the records and it was pretty obvious what was going on. So we went in and did some quick evaluation. We put a catch and release regulation on it for a few years, and that population has come right back and rebounded. And it was all because we were tipped off, I think, because of voluntary records. So you can contact your local regional office. We send out books in the summer, we send out books in the winter, and then we send out postage so you can mail them back to us. We punch the data into the computer and we send the books back to you so you can have them for your own records. But even if you only fish for 4 or 5 times a summer, you may only fish a certain water 2 or 3 times, but so may a dozen other people. And over time, that information can be very useful to us. So we very much appreciate that. And if you're fishing in a place where you see a voluntary box, if you can take the time to fill out a card. So places like the East Outlet, the Moose River, some of our trout ponds, we're doing research on some trout ponds. So we have voluntary boxes at those places, and the information we get is very valuable for those little ponds. And this year we're going to have vol boxes up on the West Branch below Ripogenus to try to collect some information there. So that's the best way for people to help us out.
Great, thank you so much. So actually, I think we're just gonna sort of end the conversation there for today. I want to thank Tim for joining us for this presentation. We had quite a few people joining us live, so it's always good to see. And I'm encouraging everybody that to join us next week, April 8th. We are continuing the spring presentation series, and I'll have Kelsey Sullivan, our turkey and other game bird biologist, talking about turkey management in Maine. So some more good series for our presentations from our biologists and field staff here. So thank you again, Tim, for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.